of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation to present some elements of my research on Islamic law and legal practice in the pre-modern Sahara, so southern Maghreb and West Africa. The richness of Islamic legal documents as a source for the history of women and marginalized groups in the pre-modern Muslim world has been widely recognized in the last decades. Court records and fatwa collections have enabled historians to insist on the agency of subalterns in the Middle East and North Africa, while highlighting the importance of the Islamic judiciary as a public forum where those of marginal status could express themselves. However, most of these path-breaking studies maintain a strong urban focus, whereas life realities of women, slaves, and other outsiders in rural areas remain poorly researched, especially before the second half of the 19th century. The difficulty to access adequate source materials is often alleged as an explanation for this gap. Furthermore, Islamic legal institutions and Muslim scholarship in general are most often considered as marginal elements within agrarian and pastoral societies, where different types of customary law are supposed to have regulated most forms of social interaction. The spread of Islamic legal scholarship in rural North Africa from the later Middle Ages onwards attests otherwise. In the sedentary and nomadic communities of the Maghreb and the Sahara, the work of Muslim jurists between the 15th and the 19th centuries initiated an acculturative process through which Islamic law profoundly reshaped local social landscapes. The activities of Muslim jurists were not limited to the mere application of the Sharia. They led to the emergence of a full-fledged intellectual and textual tradition that allows us to reconstruct both the emergence of a rural legal culture and the multiple ways in which individuals and communities made use of Islamic legal institutions and devices. The integration of Islamic law within the local socio-cultural milieu is most perceptible in the genre of the fatwa collections that flourished especially in Saharan societies since the 17th century. Based on question-answer patterns, su'ila fa'ajaba in Arabic, but also containing transcriptions of archival documents such as notarial deeds or letters, these case collections, nawazil, or replies, ajwiba, as they are called in Arabic, articulate nothing less than the perpetual negotiation of the place of the Sharia within society, and therefore provide us with a unique access to the history of the rural areas in pre-modern North Africa. In this presentation, I rely on a series of unedited Nawazil collections compiled in the 18th century in the oasis of Touat in present-day southern Algeria, in order to study the role of Islamic law in the negotiation of relations between members of social elites and subaltern groups. So here, just two pictures on the kind of manuscripts I'm working on. Mm-hmm. So here, and for those who read Arabic, you have this particular وَسُئِلَ فَأَجَابَ structure, so question-answer. During the early modern period, the Touat region, whose inhabitants mainly lived from irrigated agriculture, became one of the most important places of Muslim scholarship in the Sahara, leaving us with a rich literary heritage of which the Nawazil collections are arguably the most distinctive feature. This process also led to the formation of a network of Qadi courts, which were able to operate in the fortified villages of the oasis called Qsur. So if I go back, I cannot go back. Never mind. The judicial system in the oasis of Touat must be seen in the wider context of a social order based on patrilineal kinship structures and statutory hierarchies, whereas so-called Marabtin lineage groups vindicated social prestige through erudition, sainthood, or descent from venerated religious figures, most political power was concentrated among lineages claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad, Shurfa, as they are called in this region. Both groups acquired their economic resources mostly from landed property and engagement in caravan trade. The Shurfa group seemed to have been particularly involved in operating slave trade networks between the southern Maghreb and the Niger Belt. Many cases documented in the Nawazil records deal with various contracts and arrangements between Shurfa concerning the transport and sale of enslaved persons from West Africa across the Sahara. Thus, in sharp contrast to the common image of the Sharif or the Sayyid Iranian world, as a variation of the saintly man in Islam, the shurfa of Tuat appear rather as secular notables who furthermore engage in raiding and other forms of armed struggle. To enforce their authority, the Murabtin and Shurfa elites relied on a vast subaltern population of slaves, abid as they are called, and other clientel groups of sub-Saharan origin called haratin. While it seems that most slaves were to perform household services inside Murabtin and Shurfa households, or in the case of women, were exploited as concubines, the haratin population was mainly employed as agricultural workers through diverse sharecropping arrangements, the most important being the Khamasa contract, in which the tenant officially receives 1/5 of the crops. As many anthropologists and historians of rural North Africa have pointed out, such sharecropping contracts were parts of larger patterns of subordination and domination through which the haratin population was maintained in a situation of social precarity. A fatwa issued by a scholar from the oasis of Zaghlou in southern Tuat, sometimes in the middle of the 18th century, makes a rather explicit statement on the matter. He was asked about the case of a haratin incapable of repaying his debts, who was compelled to work for his creditors. The Mufti replied that such, I quote, labor is indeed obligatory for him because it is the only way how they, the haratin, participate in commercial transactions in our country. If they had not their labor to sell, nobody would do business with them and they would become a burden for the Muslim community. The fatwa collections from Tuat thus attests to the existence of various forms of dependency underpinning everyday life in the oasis. But they also show how Islamic legal institutions provided a public forum, to borrow again Leslie Pierce's expression, where structures and devices of subordination could at least be challenged. On the one hand, this was due to the fact that statutory classifications had to be upheld against the egalitarian ethos of Islamic law, which is reluctant to accept other legal persons than Muslims or non-Muslims being of free or servile status. On the other hand, because of the strong emphasis that Islamic law places on the protection of individual rights, especially with regard to property, local Qadi courts could serve as a conduit to question authority relations and customary conceptions of social status. My paper aims to outline these trouble spots of pre-modern Tuati society and look at how fiqh norms contributed to shape them. During my talk today, I shall be mostly concerned with cases involving members of the haratin groups. The final version of my paper will further discuss the question of how enslaved persons appeared as actors in the Nawazil collections. Suffice it to say now that while in cases involving haratin, litigation usually turns around property claims, those engaging enslaved people predominantly relate to the social and legal consequences of sexual relations and pregnancies. The discursive reconstruction of legal litigation in the Nawazil literature puts at the center individuals claiming or defending their rights, and it's therefore through such an interpersonal perspective that we apprehend the local statutory order and the power relations it generates. This can be illustrated by a query addressed to a Tuati Mufti from the 17th century. I quote, he was asked about the legal case of Muhammad al-Asnuni when he manumitted his servant Abu al-Khair. Between them, only links of patronage, wala, continued to exist, since they had concluded that courteous relations shall remain between them, and that the former master and his descendants entrust the children of the servant with the occupation of some of their houses. Abu al-Khair charged 3 of his children with the task in the customary way, but then one of his wives filed a claim requesting the houses for her own children. As a result, the former master also filed a claim and wanted her to return the houses. The Nazila forcefully illustrates how the interaction between social elites and subaltern groups was embedded within a network of clientele relationships that usually spanned over several generations. At the same time, it shows that such relationships were actively negotiated by both elite and subaltern actors. In effect, one of the peculiarities of the jurisprudential material from Tuat is that it gives us with an intimate gaze on interpersonal relations between masters and servants. We learn, for example, about a woman from a prominent Murabtin lineage who became engaged with a Haratin. Although her choice was heavily contested by her brothers, quote, because of the disgrace that would result from such a union, one of her paternal uncles accepted to ask to act as her legal tutor, and the marriage was concluded. Unsurprisingly, the brothers filed a case before a local Qadi, requesting the annulation of the marriage, fasakh. The Qadi decided to consult on the matter one of the most distinguished jurisconsults in the region. In his fatwa, this jurisconsult appeared somewhat embarrassed by the case. He starts by evoking the fundamental principle of equality in Islamic normative discourse. It is the quote, and I will finish with this case. Quote, it is the general accepted norm in our school, Mashhur al-Madhab, that the client is equal to the freeborn woman, al-Mawla kafil al-Hurra. The Mufti then goes on to qualify his position by acknowledging the harm, darar, that might indeed result from the disgrace, and insists on the potential conflicts the marriage may cause. However, in the end, he seems hesitant to caution the annulation. He stipulates that the disreputable character of the groom must be formally proven before any legal action can be taken. In my view, the case is remarkable from both the perspective of local and social and legal history. It shows how a woman in an 18th century Saharan oasis, at least partially, succeeds in having her choice to marry with a man of subaltern status validated, despite the open resistance of her brothers. Such narratives on the agency of women in North African rural societies not only are quite rare with regard to the pre-modern period, they furthermore challenge conventional conceptions of Saharan tribal societies as governed by static patriarchal structures and the domination of patrilineal groups. Finally, we see that legal concepts like social equality, kafa'a, or communal honorability, adala, could be and were mobilized in order to legitimate statutory discriminations, but that such strategies were nonetheless submitted to the formal constraints of Islamic law in the sense that they had to be legally substantiated in order to be operative.